Welcome to the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season is all about the 7 transitions of young adulthood, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about the responsibility transition. I'm your host, Roslyn Hernandez, and the young adults we'll hear from today are Esteban, Raye, Laura, Amalia, Seth, and Raechel. But first, here is Steve with an overview of the responsibility transition.
All right, so let's talk about the responsibility transition. We define the responsibility transition as a young adult bearing the weight or taking on more of the responsibility of the ways that they direct their lives and the ways that they invest in their relationships. Think about it this way. Especially for teenagers, a lot of times the responsibility for their lives is shared with another concerned adult, a parent, a legal guardian, a grandparent, a family. In many ways, they're making decisions based on what others have told them to do. But as they move into young adulthood, that shifting of responsibility moves from the adults in one's lives to young adults having to ask these questions themselves. It's actually really interesting. I've worked with a lot of college students, and they sort of have these crisis moments. Sometimes they're second, third, fourth years of college where you'll see them all of a sudden change their majors, ask deeper questions about what they're doing with their lives. Why? Because sometimes the ways that they've been living their lives up to that point has been dictated or encouraged or supported by the adults in their lives that they love and care for. And now all of a sudden they're getting to a point where they have to sort of own these decisions themselves. I think there's also something associated with this when we think about some traditions that are much more familial as well. What's my responsibility in a family system? I used to be this teenager, but now that I'm in my 20s, what responsibility do I have for myself? For my family? What is my voice in decision making? Who do I support? Who do I honor? Who do I care for? And so the sense of responsibility becomes something that young adults must think about, because it's not just about their lives, it's about the lives of those that they are connected with as well.
So Steve just mentioned that young adults are taking responsibility for themselves as individuals, but they're also starting to take responsibility with and for others. As you'll hear from Esteban, it is exactly his connection with his parents that has caused him to think more deeply about taking responsibility.
I feel like just seeing people around me get older has really just gave me that extra motivation and just pushed me to just be, I don't want to say the word grown up, you know what I mean? But just mature. Yeah, because I really feel it when I tell you that I still feel like I'm a young kid that just moved over, but I've been just transforming. It's almost like you have to, it's like it's a car that's on drive and you just have to deal with it, That's been my journey where I'm just seeing people get older and I'm feeling it. I feel it in my heart and I'm just like, yeah, I gotta start thinking about carrying my parents. I started thinking about maybe a family, which means I have to, mature in so many different areas.
While some young adults are feeling the desire to take on more responsibility, especially for people around them or to create more connections, there are others who are also taking responsibility in a different way. This may be in ways that contribute to their differentiation journey. Here's what Raye shared about that.
I feel like for me, the transition has been taking ownership and responsibility for my own life path and choosing something because it's what I want to do, not because it's what I think my parents or family or others expect me to do. And I think a theme that comes up is just differentiation. I think choosing what I want to do. My therapist talks about being me and then letting others feel the weight of me being me. And I think that's been something that's been hard when I put myself out there and I want others' excitement. I want them to come alongside me. And when that doesn't happen, how do I still remain grounded and anchored? And this is still me. And though it would be nice to have others coming alongside, I know this is just me and I'm going to choose this regardless. And then hopefully finding others to come alongside who can see and can support.
Marriage is an experience that impacts a lot of different areas of life. Here's one of Laura's reflections on how marriage has influenced responsibility transitions for her.
Navigating very practically like budgeting with another person. I wasn't really great at budgeting beforehand anyways. Thankfully my husband is really good with math and numbers, but we spend money differently. We talked about how like the American like individualism butts heads with marriage so much because marriage is such a like dying to self each day, doing something that's for the greater good rather than just for yourself. And especially like we are both white Americans, and so we didn't come from like a collectivistic culture at home either. Like we had like considered a big move before we got married, and we noticed that we were both saying like, this is what I want, and rather than saying like, what do we think is going to be best for us and for our marriage. And so yeah, that responsibility of my actions are also not just only affecting myself, but now they are affecting another person is really different and hard to like fully like grasp. It's not going to happen like overnight, but it's been like a longer process to navigate those responsibilities.
Sometimes responsibility transitions can be difficult, but not unsurmountable, especially when young adults have the support they need. Here's how a responsibility transition was challenging for Amalia and what she learned from it.
A difficult thing for me was becoming a pastor at the age of 22. And that immediate responsibility that was placed on me, I think up until that time, I had grown up in an environment where you were quote unquote a child. So yes, there were parts of responsibility that were given you, but it wasn't the full-fledged amount of responsibility that was given to me when I became a pastor. And so that was very difficult to gain that responsibility, like to take it on and to say, this is something I can manage, because I wasn't managing it well. What it became was responsibility was me hiding myself in order to people please, or it was me just not knowing how to be responsible in general. And so it really took a lot of time and a lot of mentors and a lot of, I think, just growth in order to recognize that responsibility was understanding who I was, understanding what my role was, and understanding what the task at hand was. And that really helped me find responsibility and manage responsibility better in that place as a young adult.
When we think about the responsibility transition, we might often think about a young adult taking more responsibility for themselves because they moved out of their parents' home, or being more responsible in marriage, or even gaining more responsibility because of parenting. But young adults are also thinking about bigger social aspects. Here's what Seth shared about his desire to take on social responsibility.
For me, the journey has been a little bit different. If anyone's listening audio, I'm like a straight white dude. I grew up in the American South in a very like Christian, pretty homogenous environment. And so for me, the journey of responsibility is almost more recognizing like just the privilege that I carry, the opportunities that I've had access to, and being responsible for my actions, like both the good and the bad. So recognizing that that privilege comes with a lot of power and access to spaces, to conversations, to opportunity. So how am I using that? There's almost a narrative that like to be mindful of that is to reject that or to be ashamed of that. And while there's a good amount of like growth and recognition of harm that I think is important, if anything, it's almost just empowered me to like build diverse friendships and to learn from people that like growing up, I wasn't, put into contact or proximity with. And it is my responsibility to unlearn so many things and to recognize my position in like a position of harm, and then to be an effective ally, an effective friend, an effective partner to folks who don't have that same kind of like privilege. I think, God can really do incredible things through that. And I'm grateful for that journey.
This is the advice that Amalia, Raye, and Raechel shared with us.
I think overall, what did keep me alive, frankly, was a few people being curious about how I was handling my responsibility instead of being fearful at how I was handling my responsibility. I am a perfectionist in general. And so, frankly, the responsibility was leading to a deep amount of insecurity that was leading to mental health issues. But I'm grateful that there was people that were just curious enough to say, I don't think you're handling all of this that well. Can I come alongside you? Can I hear your process? Can I hear what you're doing? Can I hear your worries? And being curious about my worries so that I wasn't fearful of the things that I felt like I was running, the things that were running after me. Because there was an enormous amount of pressure for me in my position. First Black woman coming into the scenario I was in. And so, again, having people that were curious was really helpful for me, and curious about my fears so that I didn't have to be fearful of that responsibility.
I think especially in this field of responsibility, I think from the leadership perspective, for those who are older or quote unquote wiser, it can be easy to just, for them to come in and say, this is how things have been done. I think often there might be even implicit judgment of like, oh, this young person isn't taking responsibility for X, Y, or Z thing. And I think I've seen a lot of my peers actually really want to, but then they just don't have the support or don't have the know-how of how to go about that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for youth leaders to walk alongside and really empower young people to step into the gifts that they do have.
I mean, I love kind of what Seth was saying about kind of choosing to take on that responsibility in a different way. And I think that it would be helpful for a youth leader to walk with people to not like, I think there's oftentimes a fear of questioning things, but I think it's to expand your mind, choosing to question or to examine the places of your own life or your heart or your upbringing, and then recognizing like, oh, God is so much bigger than what I knew, or, you know, the world is so much bigger than what I knew, and people are so much more different and diverse than what I thought I knew. I think having a more open, expanded worldview actually creates more space for empathy and relationship and community, and it creates a space for you to be more curious and learn and be a voice for others and use your like opportunities to then also share a responsibility for like the larger world as well.
Hey, so I'm back to tell you, if you're really liking the content that you're hearing in this season, we want to hook you up with a really helpful resource. It's a guide titled 7 Things You Need to Know for Successful Young Adult Ministry. This guide covers the transitions that we're talking about in the season, but it also gives you practical questions to help you engage young adults. You can download this guide at youngadultministrynext.com. I mean, you don't have to go right now, but you could. But do come back. Like, make sure you come back after you get it, because you want to hear the next part. And now let's go to the wrap-up conversation with Steve. Here we are at the wrap-up conversation for the responsibility transition.
Yes.
We hope you found great insight from the young adults.
Oh my gosh, so great.
Yes,
right?
They're amazing.
Yeah, truly amazing.
Yes, they really are truly great. And I also want to say, these young adults are amazing and very insightful. And I'm sure that young adults in everyone's lives have also insights and wisdom to share. But we just need to make the space for them. All right, what else came up in the research that maybe we didn't hear from the young adults in this previous conversation?
Well, what came up in the research, and even probably what we've heard from our young adults, is that the 20s is obviously the third decade of life is just wild, right? taking responsibility takes all types of forms simply because we're moving into our 20s where we're taking on new jobs or new relationships or responsibility for ourselves. And so a lot of things can just happen pragmatically. I get married, I have a child, I move, whatever. And these sort of conversations came up all the time. And I think it's interesting because those moves ask something of young adults that perhaps when they were younger, they didn't have to think about that much. And that the element is this responsibility element. What is my role in this new scenario where I can't simply pass off, outsource, or assume that someone else is going to take care of it? And there's a lot of weight that comes with that. In particular, one of the ways, and we know this from our research and other research, just the financial responsibility is a really interesting one. How do I do a budget? How do I think about where I'm spending my money? How do I choose with limited resources? How do I take care of things in the short term, but also think about my long-term goals? All these sort of things really come into play as we think about the responsibility transition. Relationally, too, I think there's this element of like not only how am I responsible for myself, but to whom am I responsible for? And that's not just a child or a partner. It's what does it mean in my relationship with my parents? How do I honor them or my family of origin or my family system? All these factors become increasingly more important because the role of the young adult is changing, and so those responsibilities change as well. And I think what makes the transition hard, and I'm curious what you think about this, like nobody tells you like, hey, congratulations, you're like 23 and now you did these things before and now you do these things now. Like it's much more ad hoc than that. It's much more improv. I think maybe in generations past where things were a little bit more, there weren't as many options. Like I think the rites of passages, which I think ministry talks a lot about, is really, really great. But rites of passage only work when the individual recognizes the new role that they're in and the community acknowledges the new role they're in.
And supports them in it.
And it supports them in it, right? So what happens a lot of times is we talk about rites of passage, but it's usually just from the individual side. And so what you have happen is the young adult is sort of holding the ball on like, what is this new status that I have and what am I supposed to do with it? And so I think this came up with in the research a lot as we talk with young adults of like, well, what does it mean for me to own it and hold it? And what is my responsibility, and what am I supposed to do with that? So I think that was probably a big part of it.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me, and maybe I am just in this phase of life where I'm focused on relationships, and I know we have a relational transition.
Yeah.
But from my own experience, remembering about how easy it was to make friends in high school or even in college.
Yeah.
Once we are out of specific structures and systems that kind of do some of that legwork for us, it's our responsibility to then cultivate relationships.
Right.
We have to take ownership of that. And that means doing boring things like calling someone up and being like, hey, let's look at our calendar together.
Right.
When can we meet up for lunch? Or when can we do a FaceTime call?
Absolutely.
Something like that.
Absolutely. I would completely agree. I mean, one of the terms that's a little more academic, but we use a lot in our circles as well, is just this element of agency, right? Where we don't live passive lives. At some point, we have to take responsibility for who we want to become, and that responsibility transition it can be overwhelming and liberating all at the same time, but it's encouraging agency. And so as I think about this with ministry all the time, I think sometimes what happens is that we actually aren't very great with the right responsibility transition. And let me give you an example. I find a lot of times as we've actually have done different focus groups, young adults are really afraid, or they talk a lot about this idea of the bait and switch.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so now your reaction, like I was like in this focus group and the bait and switch came up and everybody in the room did what you did. They went, oh yeah. And I'm an older type and I was like, I don't get it. But I didn't want to like feel left out. So I was like, oh yeah. But then I had the courage to actually say, so what's the bait and switch? And they're like, well, the bait and switch is when like communities are like really welcoming and they bring you in, but then as soon as you're in, all of a sudden they place demands on you of what they want you to do. What's interesting about that is the question oftentimes, and again, it's not done with ill intent, but oftentimes the questions asked of young adults are, will you serve in this ministry and volunteer? Because obviously you have time because you're a young adult. The question isn't, what do you want to take responsibility for? What do you sense God is calling you to? And how do we help encourage you in that realm?
Or what are your talents?
Yes.
What can you contribute to the community, and what would you enjoy doing?
Exactly. And so a lot of times in young adult ministry, what happens is we're like, oh my gosh, young adults are here. We've got to set up small groups for them, and we got to have this retreat, and we've got to set this up. What can happen is if we're not careful, is we take away the agency of young adults. And we ask them to attend rather than participate. And there's a difference. Attendance is passive. I've set this up for you. Won't you come to my small group? And then it reinforces to young adults coming to us as leaders saying, I don't have a small group. Where do I fit in? Rather than having a formation forward mentality where we say to young adults, so you want to be in a small group. Tell me about your friends. What would it look like for you to gather them together? I can help you perhaps resource content for what you want to talk about. But it's your job to make your friends and own those responsibilities as you step into your faith formation or the communities that you want to be a part of, right? And so the posture pastorally, I think, is different, where we don't do things for young adults, but we're inspiring their responsibilities so they take agency for their lives and for their spiritual formation.
And I think a lot of the times they do want to start taking responsibility for things.
Yeah.
And what they really need is someone to resource them or someone to support what they're doing.
Right.
And they'll just want someone to come along and say, how can I help you with that?
Absolutely.
Another thing that came to my mind when you were talking about how we might create programs and just expect them to show up.
Yeah.
And sometimes, we feel like, oh, they're so busy, or they don't prioritize church.
Yeah.
Well, they're taking a lot of responsibility. Some of these young people have 1 or 2 side hustles apart from their job. That's a lot of responsibility that's taking their time because they need to survive. They need to pay for school. They need to buy their groceries, pay their bills.
Absolutely.
And those are very practical realities that sometimes as leaders we forget because we're thinking of, we need to get you to the pew to sit down.
Absolutely. That's actually a great question for you all to ask young adults. Like we've done this, we have young adults over at our house a lot of times. We ask them, what's your side hustle? 80% of them have side hustles. So ask your young adult after you get to know them a little bit, like, okay, I know this is like your job or what you do, but what's your side hustle? You will open up a whole new chapter of what they're interested in, what they're investing in, what they're trying to accomplish. That is a worthy conversation, don't you think?
Yeah. So what are tips that we have given or any other tips that we want to add?
Yeah. Ask them about their side hustle. I think that'd be great. I think also as we're mentoring young adults, don't be so quick to think that you have to be the answer person, but to think about their agency and what it means for them, to encourage them to take responsibility, which they want to take. But perhaps they haven't had the opportunity to do that. And I think what we're encouraging them to do then is to really own where they're going. And that's something that they desperately want and need in their lives. I do think also there's maybe an element of compassion where sometimes there's competing responsibilities that I think came up in our conversations, and perhaps we even heard that in the podcast as well, where we have to negotiate multiple responsibilities. There isn't a right and wrong. It's usually between good and better, or good and good.
Or what's urgent.
Yeah, or what's urgent, right? And I think appreciating those spaces may give room for you to really show up where they need you the most.
That's great. That's awesome. Thanks so much for this.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, that was the responsibility transition wrap-up conversation. We hope that those tips and these conversations, or this little conversation that we had about it, was helpful. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification button, and give us a like if you liked what you saw today, if this was helpful. And don't forget that we're all in this conversation.
Absolutely.
Right? here in the podcast, the young adults that got to talk to each other, and you with us in the comments, and young adults with you in the comments. We're all learning from each other. So
Absolutely.
go to the comments on YouTube and let
Please
us know what
tell
you
us.
think. Ask us questions, and maybe a young adult might answer and let you know.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So we'll see you on the next one. Bye. This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. Check out the show notes for links to all of the resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you want to not just listen, but also watch this podcast, you can go find us on the Fuller Youth Institute YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening or watching.